Thank you, and yeah, thanks for the opportunity to come and speak today. It's nice to have a chance to present some of this to a slightly different audience than I typically present to, and there will be some sections where I'll actually ask specifically for feedback and your insights. And if you have thoughts later on and want to email me, that would be great. Looking forward to kind of continuing a conversation around this issue. So I hope I'm not doing too much, trying to squeeze too much in with this talk, but I wanted to give you a sense of the sort of multiple strategies or approaches that I use to address what is the underlying question of a good chunk of the research that I do, which is how can we make biodiversity conservation work when in areas where poverty is a concern and development is a need. So that's sort of what drives a good portion of my research overall, and certainly the questions that I'll be talking about today. And I wanted to give you a little bit of a background on my sort of training, just to give you a sense of the perspective I have on this question. And so I have a PhD in ecology from UC Davis, but with an emphasis on human ecology. But human ecology can mean a lot of different things to a lot of different people, so that's not actually a super helpful label to use. I was based in an anthropology department, but worked most closely with a group of evolutionary anthropologists, so human behavioral ecologists or kind of cultural evolutionary theorists, so not sort of standard anthropologists. So we kind of have a sort of biological approach to human behavior. And I approach the issue that I've kind of laid out today from a sort of conservation perspective. So my goal first and foremost is to understand conservation, how to make that work better. So I often kind of will describe myself as a conservation social scientist because in addition to sort of evolutionary anthropology, I had a committee member from political science, and I draw on literature from economics and new institutional economics and sociology and psychology, etc. So largely what I try to address or incorporate into this research is sort of theories of cooperation and collective action, how institutions emerge and evolve and what that means for resource management, costs and benefits both at the individual level when it comes to sort of decisions about adopting behavior or managing resources, and trade-offs and how to make those sort of explicit. So with community-based conservation, just to give you a little bit more background about the problem in general, we're going to kind of take a step back first. So the kind of predominant approach to conservation historically has been a focus on national parks and protected areas. And I think for a lot of us, this might be the sort of first image that might pop into mind, kind of sort of quote-unquote pristine wild areas, beautiful places, wildlife. But what's often missing from these pictures are the people that either live within or nearby national parks and protected areas and are in many ways impacted by those protected areas. And when you have kind of protected areas and local populations, you often end up with conflict. And there have been a number of critiques of national parks and protected areas, both in the sense that they can be unjust when people are evicted or have their livelihoods severely constrained. They can be financially very expensive to sort of maintain and manage and run well and efficiently or effectively. And from an ecological perspective, they may not necessarily always be that effective. When you think about sort of megafauna and the size of their home ranges, protected areas aren't always sufficient. When you think about climate change and habitats shifting and home ranges shifting, putting just a kind of fence or a boundary around a particular area isn't always going to be in your best interest when you're trying to conserve habitat or species. So given those critiques, in the past sort of few decades, I guess, there's been more of a transition to a different kind of approach, a more participatory approach, one that engages with local communities, one that seeks to provide economic benefits of one kind or another. And this is often sort of put under the term of community-based conservation. And there are a number of different labels and strategies and approaches that you'll probably see in the literature, co-management ecotourism, biosphere reserves, community-based natural resource management, etc. I tend to sort of lump these all under the same umbrella, even though there are some nuances to them, but from my perspective, they largely attempt to include multiple goals. So one of which is, are based on similar logic, which is that providing access to resources and seeking to engage the community is often more likely to lead to more buy-in and better conservation outcomes, and providing economic benefits or other kinds of development opportunities can sort of incentivize sustainable resource management. So we sort of lump these all together. And now, community-based conservation has not always been successful, and it's not always been free of controversy. There are a lot of critiques of this idea of the romantic kind of community and what that means and whether those really exist, and about how well community-based conservation has really been implemented. So from our perspective, my colleagues and I, our goal has been to get a better understanding of when and why community-based conservation programs succeed or fail. And the first step in that process for us is really being clear about what we mean by success. And I think this is important for a couple of reasons. One, because as I sort of described, these projects often involve inherently multiple goals. Development, conservation, changing behaviors. So looking at just one component of that isn't going to give you a full picture. You could have an ecologist could come to a project area and measure a certain indicator, biomass or species diversity, and get a different picture of that project than an anthropologist would, who would get a different picture than an economist might. So our argument is that it's critical for groups to evaluate projects on multiple goals. And so we kind of came up with these four. We think it's important to consider attitudes and whether the attitudes of the community are changing towards conservation in general or to that project in particular. To look at changes in behaviors and whether resource behaviors have changed as a result of that project. To look at obviously ecological changes and whether the habitat or species of interest is in better condition as a result of the project. And finally economic, whether kind of clear income or other economic benefits or other development benefits in terms of say schools or roads or hospitals, etc. have been provided. So that's the kind of first, and just pardon me, I've got a cold today, so I might reach for the water bottle a few times. But the kind of key point here is that we're really emphasizing the need to have to measure multiple outcomes with these kinds of projects. And so today I'm going to talk about a particular case study from my work in Bhutan that will illustrate the importance of these four measures, as well as the meta-analyses that we've done, the second of which is sort of a work in progress still. So with the first work that I did in Bhutan, this was about a third of my research, was looking at this process of decentralization. And I think that's probably something you're all somewhat familiar with. So this, what I'm defining here is the transfer of authority and management functions related to resources from a central government to lower level actors and institutions. And this has been fairly common globally, particularly in terms of resource management. And I think there's fairly good rationale or good logic behind doing this, the idea that local communities will be better able to sort of monitor and enforce locally made rules, that transaction costs will be lower, that local communities have a better sense of the ecological dynamics of the resources that they're managing than a centralized government might, and that local communities will have more buy-in and will be more kind of incentivized to protect resources that they depend directly upon. But again, there have been concerns about how well sort of decentralization programs in general have been sort of implemented and whether they really can be effective over the long term. And so there has also been quite a bit of work on when we would expect sort of local level resource management to be successful, or to succeed. And this is just a subset of a much longer list that Agrawal put together in 2001, and Ostrom has since added to that. Her paper in 2007 kind of added a few components to this. And I've sort of selected this list in particular because, or this subset of the list, because these conditions are largely met in the communities that I've worked in Bhutan. So there's a good reason to expect that decentralizing resource management should be effective in the context of Bhutan. But I will suggest here that there's an important piece that's missing from this, and walking through the kind of four outcomes will sort of lead us to what that missing piece is. So here I'm talking about the harvest of the Matsutake mushroom in Bhutan, and the Matsutake mushroom is collected in two main regions, Genika, Geog in western Bhutan, and Ora in central Bhutan, and a Geog is just sort of a collection of villages, it's a community. And an important point here is that Matsutake is not a resource that has sort of a long history of use in Bhutan. People would tell us stories about how when they were kids, they used to just, when they were taking their livestock out to graze, they'd come across it on the trail and just kind of kick it over and just ignore it. They didn't eat it, it wasn't part of their diet. And then in the early 1990s, a Japanese businessman saw it somewhere in Bhutan and said, oh, that's Matsutake, give me everything you got. And from that point on, sort of an export chain was established, and it's become a very valuable commodity for these communities in particular. So I'm going to give you a little bit of a sense, because this is important as well, of the sort of decentralization sort of history in Bhutan, and it sort of mirrors the same sort of trajectory that's occurred in the region in general, in India and Nepal in particular, where for a long period there was sort of evidence of traditional resource management institutions. They used to have this institution called Sokshing, which was about, it kind of governed their forest use as communities, and that as far as I can tell, were largely successful and largely effective. And those were sort of wiped away with the 1969 Forest Act, where basically overnight all forests were centralized and governed under the central government. And you saw the kind of erosion of these traditional resource management institutions. And then in the sort of early and mid-90s, there was a recognition that, hey, maybe this wasn't such a good idea. Let's work on sort of political decentralization in general, but also decentralizing resource management back to the community level. And a number of resources were chosen as kind of pilot studies, and Matsutake was one of those resources. So in terms of kind of walking through the outcomes, I should note that most of this information I'm providing here comes from focus group meetings and informal interviews and behavioral follows and structured surveys that were all done in 2005 and 2006. So from an economic perspective, I think you could argue that this harvest has been a pretty good success. It averages up to about a third of annual household income and can earn up to 75% of annual household income. And the collection season is about 3 months, and really it's about 6 to 8 weeks that it's at its sort of peak. So that's a pretty good haul for about 6 to 8 weeks worth of sort of collection. So this has been sort of a godsend, and that's why it gets its name, the Buddha mushroom. So in Dzongkha, the local language, or the national language, it's called Sangye Shamu. So Sangye is Buddha and Shamu is mushroom. And it's just been perceived as this gift that's kind of been bestowed on the communities. Okay, so it's been economically very valuable for these communities. From a behavioral perspective, maybe not so much. So early on in the process, there is an organization that's sort of affiliated with the Ministry of Agriculture called the National Mushroom Center. They were sort of mandated to work with these communities to help them develop a set of guidelines for how to sort of harvest sustainably. And these guidelines are intended to maintain the post-harvest sort of quality of the mushrooms so they get the best price for them, but also to maintain the sort of biological productivity. So you'll see rules that relate to how you should and shouldn't harvest the mushrooms in order to protect the mycelium, when you should do it to ensure that there's enough sort of spore dispersal before you're harvesting, and how you should sort of collect and carry them to the export site so that you're not damaging the mushroom but also are able to kind of spread spores as you walk. Unfortunately, these two are the only ones that are really sort of followed with any degree of regularity. It's clearly in their best interest to exclude outsiders from harvesting their mushrooms. And there are minimum size restrictions. You're not allowed to sell. You'll get fined at the export site if you sell a mushroom that's bigger than about 2.5 inches. But there's nothing to preclude you from harvesting a smaller one and just putting it in your pocket and taking it home and eating it home. So the enforcement of these things is lax, and that's kind of putting it nicely. So behaviorally, there hasn't been a real emphasis on really making sure that people are changing their behaviors to make sure that this is a sustainable harvest. And that has sort of played out into this problem, which is, I'm going to focus on the dotted line here, which is the nationwide export rate each year from about 1995 to 2005. And you can see that the peak was in about 97 at about close to 16,000 kilograms, and it declined to under 2,000 by 2001 and has pretty much plateaued since then. And when you ask so these have been a little bit disputed in terms of the cause of the decline by some folks in Bhutan. But if you ask the collectors, is the productivity declining, the majority will say yes, so 82% said yes. And if you ask them why, the majority of them will say there's either too many collectors or people aren't collecting properly. So you have these sort of loose institutions in place, but you don't have any mechanism for monitoring and enforcement. And this trend has kind of continued today. So this is an article from the end of the last collection season in August in 2013. And the harvest rate was back around 2,000 kilograms. So it's never really gone up much from that level, and it's kind of right there as well. So I haven't kind of looked specifically at this since about 2008 when I was there presenting some of these results, but my guess is that there really hasn't been much progress made in terms of enforcing those institutions. And then when you ask the collectors what they think should be done about it, the largest single response is that, well, people should collect properly. It's sort of individual responsibility. But when you sort of pool the responses, the top half here are things that individuals or the community should do, and the bottom half is things that the government should do. You can see that about 2/3 of the responses are that the government should be more involved. They want the government to ban it, they want the government to strengthen laws, the government to limit the number of collectors. And I think this, I'm sort of arguing that this is sort of an attitudinal failure. There's just a general unwillingness at the community level to manage the harvest. They don't really want this responsibility. And I think that there are three sort of explanations for why this might be the case. The first is that there's a sort of feedback or a time lag between the time that a problem is sort of recognized and the causes of that problem are identified, and then there's a reaction to that. So it may just be that this hasn't been going on long enough for it to be clear that changing their behaviors will be effective and that they should sort of bear the cost of doing that. That's sort of an argument I made in this paper in 2010 from this data back in 2006. We're now at 2013. I'm not so sure that holds a whole lot of weight anymore. Although, to be honest, you can't say with 100% certainty what the cause of the decline is, but I think the evidence suggests that it's, at least in large part, due to poor collection practices and too many collectors. The second potential explanation is that maybe this resource isn't as important as we all think it is. So I showed you the tremendous kind of contribution it makes to their income, and from that perspective, you think, well, of course they would want to protect this thing. They're making, 1/3 to 3/4 of their annual income in, a 3-month period collecting this. Sure, they want to protect it. But these guys are farmers and herders. They're not mushroom collectors. It hasn't been a part of their sort of cultural history. It's not something they did for a long period. It's not something they learned from their parents and grandparents. It's something that's relatively new, and it hasn't been a part of their sort of identity and livelihood for a very long time. So it may just be that they're viewing this as sort of a gift. When they have a good year, they have a good year, and when they don't, they don't. And maybe to these collectors, it's not, or these communities, it's not worth the costs of setting up and maintaining these institutions to protect the resource. So that's a second possibility. And the third is that there is this historical dependence on the government. And yes, there are sort of, in these communities, there are effective forest and irrigation management institutions.
When you say government, do you mean national government? Because with the word decentralization, I think it's the evolution of tasks and resources to support those tasks, even to a lower level of government, right?
Yeah, so when I say government, I'm referring to the national government here, yeah. And the sort of district level government is, and the strengthening of that, district and community level sort of governance organizations are fairly sort of new in terms of being sort of robust and involved in decision making.
Right.
That was part of the sort of overall political decentralization. Yeah, so that's important. When I talk about government, I'm talking about the national government. Yes?
How direct is the trade?
So it goes through, the collectors will bring their harvest down about 2 or 3 times a week to Bhutanese exporters, who will then sort of sort and process, take it to the national airport, and then it goes on the chain.
Most people connect to market dynamics that local coyote plays, right? The role that market intermediary plays, because they may be buffering trends, both good and bad.
Yes, so part of the explanation for the decline in this particular era, as I believe there was a recession in Japan in this era.
There's alternative supplies as well.
Yes, yeah, so it is also harvested in Korea, parts of China, Western US and Canada. So yes, you're correct that the Bhutanese sort of portion of the overall global Matsutake trade is relatively small, yeah. Right, so in terms of dependence on the government, there is evidence that, yes, they're unwilling to sort of manage this themselves. They expect or would like the government to play a larger role. And this is despite the fact that they've done fairly well on their own managing forests and irrigation water, but those have been sort of historically part of their livelihood. This is a newer resource. It emerged before the sort of transition to sort of decentralized resource management. And so they at least, if not have a dependence on the government, they at least trust in sort of national sort of institutions a little bit more maybe than their local community institutions in regards to this specific resource. And there's fairly good reason for doing that. So, you know, after about 1965 or 1969, when Bhutan really started sort of a concerted development effort, they made pretty staggering sort of advances in terms of quality of life and standard of living. Pretty much any measure you have of quality of life and standard of living has been on the increase in Bhutan, and that's largely because of sort of progressive and wise planning from the central government. So I'm not saying it's wrong that they're sort of have a historical dependence, but it's showing up in negative ways here. And you actually see this not just with Matsutake, but with several other resources. Lemongrass is one. This is the sort of conclusion from a framework plan from the Ministry of Agriculture in 2002 that I'll just kind of let you read real quick here. Yes?
Was this reported by Bhutanese people or
Yes.
from the World Bank or something?
No, this is from the Council on Renewable Resource Research Bhutan. Yeah, it was in charge of this sort of CBNRM program. Yeah. So yes, it seems like in terms of attitudes, you would maybe call this an attitudinal failure, and it seems like there's potentially another sort of variable that you can add to the sort of list of diagnostic variables that Ostrom and others have put together. This idea of commitment to decentralization, that if you're going to sort of turn over rights and responsibilities to local communities, it may be important to get a sense of whether they're sort of willing to bear those costs that are involved with that, and have an interest in sort of bearing those responsibilities. So just kind of running back through the four outcomes, attitudinal behavior and ecological failure, it appears, even if there's been economic success to some degree, although even with a drop in costs, you could argue that hasn't been super successful in the long term. And I'm going to argue that part of these sort of failures relates to capacity, the sort of knowledge and ability to manage these resources, supportive cultural background, the fact that it hasn't been a sort of historical part of their sort of traditional practices, and a lack of leadership. And that has to do with sort of some attempts at monitoring and enforcement that failed because of a lack of leadership, but I can get into that a little later. I highlight these because they are an important part of what I'll talk about next with the meta-analysis. So that case study gives you a sense of a community-based conservation effort in one specific location with one specific resource, but in the 2001 AgriWall paper, he makes the point that it's important to get kind of beyond case studies and to have more kind of comparative statistical approaches to understand more broadly when we might expect community-based conservation to succeed or fail. So my colleagues Carrie and Monique and I embarked on this meta-analysis. This is the second one we did. The first one was in 2006, but this one is a little bit more comprehensive. So we looked at 5 online databases and used 6 search terms and ended up with 136 case studies from 40 different countries. And so this is sort of how the study was set up. So for each sort of paper that we found in our search, it describes one or more particular projects, which are represented by the red stars here. And obviously each of these projects is embedded in a particular national context. So we have measures of sort of governance and sort of economic development. Then within each paper, we coded for information on about 65 variables per project. So things like community characteristics, what factors of the community or aspects of the community and the surrounding environment might impact community-based conservation outcomes, and what aspects of the project design might influence community-based conservation outcomes. And these sort of variables obviously tied into our hypotheses. This idea that more sort of stable and transparent governance or governments would result in sort of higher trust, maybe less resentment about conservation programs, that sort of higher levels of sort of economic development and more equitable economic development might lead to more conformity with rules and lower time discount rates. These are sort of the most simplistic hypotheses that we have. There's certainly more nuances to these that you can imagine. In terms of community characteristics, so for example, local sort of land tenure or property rights might lead people to have lower time discount rates. There's more certainty about long-term access to the resource. Maybe market integration provides substitutes for local resources or gives an incentive to harvest more sustainably. Ethnic homogeneity might result in sort of greater trust among community members and more collective action, etc. And then in terms of project design, let's say, for instance, you're sort of encouraging more participation in sort of all aspects of the project from sort of design to implementation. Maybe that leads to more local level buy-in and more sort of conformity with rules. If you're providing economic benefits, that gives people more incentive, again, to harvest sustainably. If you are, let's say, talking about sort of engagement and participation, again, it relates to these issues with decentralization in general. Local communities having more knowledge of local ecological dynamics, lower sort of transaction costs in terms of monitoring enforcement, etc. So we have a whole series of hypotheses that we lay out in a little more detail in our paper. Yeah.
Can you explain a little bit more about discount rates?
Yeah. So in terms of economic benefits, let's say, so if you're providing an economic benefit, maybe the increasing wealth in the community will allow them to make decisions to sort of stint on their resource use a little more than they would if there weren't kind of clear economic benefits from it. Or in terms of property rights, the same thing, that if they have more secure rights over their property, the land or the resources, that they'd be more willing to sort of stint on their use with the knowledge that in the future that will pay off.
As well as, I'm guessing, the trust that a stream of payments are actually going to materialize?
Yes, that as well, yeah. So in terms of outcomes, I guess I should mention how we've been measuring our outcome variable here. So we have a sort of 3-level outcome variable, which is sort of the best you could do given that we're sort of relying on information that's being reported in the papers that we're drawing from. So success means among a variety of indicators that could be used in any one of these 4 domains, that the majority of those suggested that the project has been successful. And limited success would mean that some of those indicators suggest it's been successful, or if you're thinking of a number of villages that are involved, maybe the project has been successful behaviorally in some villages but not in others. And failure means, again, that the sort of majority of indicators suggest that it's failed in each domain. And what we see actually is somewhat surprisingly, given the sort of tone about community conservation in the literature, is that we found that there's been, there were more successes than failures across all 4 domains. And of course, these are reports by the authors, and these are often independent authors, so it's not that they necessarily have an incentive to report success all the time, at least. But I think it is interesting to see that there were a higher number of successes across all these domains. But our real interest was then in determining what factors are associated with success. So we first did a quick sort of bivariate analysis, and this slide's a bit of a mess, but really what I want to focus on is this. So each of the rows here represents a particular variable within each of those 3 domains that I mentioned, and then you've got the 4 columns for the outcomes. So a black cell just indicates that there was a significant association between the independent variable and the outcome. And I just want to emphasize that you've got a pretty good mass of black cells in the project design category. So it seems like project design variables are pretty critical for these project success. But in terms of looking at them more closely, sort of combining these variables together in a multivariate analysis, I'm only going to show 2 of the outcomes here just so I don't bore you, but I just want to give you a sense of the general trend in our results. So these are the reduced form models. So we put all those variables into a model. We did sort of backwards stepwise AIC model reduction, model selection, and the kind of squared variables are the significant predictors. So for ecological outcomes, we see that higher participation, higher engagement with the community, and capacity building were important for ecological success. And similarly, capacity, strong local institutions, and a smaller population size were important for behavioral success. And overall, that was kind of the trend, that project design variables in particular, and then sort of community characteristics to some degree were pretty critical for the success across the 4 domains. Oops. So just sort of wrapping things up for this meta-analysis, the argument we're making is that, well, yes, CBC can work, that there actually were more successes than we sort of anticipated coming into this, but obviously it's not a cure-all. And we see a fairly small number of variables that came out of our models as being sort of important indicators of success. Capacity, engagement, the provision of sort of social capital, working with communities to enhance sort of pride and empowerment and connectivity. Strong local institutions, strong tenure rights in terms of economic outcomes, smaller communities, and projects that have existed for a longer period of time. And one sort of summary conclusion we reached was that good project design can help overcome national contexts and community characteristics that may not be ideal. And I think this is a good thing because as a conservation practitioner, you're not going to be able to come in and change Gini inequality coefficients, or you're not going to be able to change governance scores, or you're not necessarily going to be able to change the ethnic makeup of a community. What you can control is the way you design your project to fit into a given context. So I also want to note that we're not arguing that national context and community characteristics are unimportant, but our results suggest that regardless of what the characteristics are, good project design can make things work. And we also kind of reiterate our call for sort of more rigorous and more standardized monitoring. The data that we are drawing from in this study ranged from sort of very informal qualitative work to more rigorous qualitative work to more rigorous quantitative work to sort of pseudo-experimental design. And with no sort of standardization in terms of the outcomes that were measured, of the indicators that were used for a given outcome. So I think having that more sort of systematic monitoring of community-based conservation project will be very important moving ahead. Okay, so that was looking at each of our 4 domains independently. And the goal of these projects of community-based conservation in general is to sort of produce win-win-win situations where you're producing sort of synergies among all these outcomes. They're intended to provide economic development, protect ecological resources, boost communities. And so the next step, and this is the step that's sort of the work in progress, is getting an understanding of when do these projects produce synergies as opposed to kind of clear trade-offs. And to do that, we sort of changed our outcome variables a little bit. So we sort of put attitudinal and behavioral variables to the side and focused on our sort of social capital variable to include that as an outcome for this study. And the reason we did that is because the few studies that have looked at synergies and trade-offs before tend to have some sort of abstract social measurement in there. And for us, this seemed to make the most sense. It's sort of the intangible benefits at the community level. Things like social connectivity and empowerment and pride in community. And the other reason is because, when you talk about the sort of standard sustainable development imagery, it's that 3-legged stool of economic, ecological, and social. So this is how we're sort of categorizing synergies for this study. And again, the ecological economic outcomes were measured on these 3, this gradient of success, and social was just coded as yes or no. Did the project produce some kind of social intangible outcome or not? And in order to kind of make our sort of dependent variable, we recoded things a little bit so that we just have a binary outcome. And we wanted to be very conservative in what we called a synergy. So we were only considering synergies as those in which there was dual success for both measures. So economic and ecological both had to be successful. If one was success and one was limited success, we still considered that a trade-off. And same for social. If social was yes and economic was limited success, that was still considered a trade-off. So we have a binary outcome variable here. And here's a quick look at, this is all of our sort of combinations before we settled on focusing on social outcomes as well, but here's the 3 possible combinations here. You can see that all are sort of below 50% in terms of synergies. The most frequent ones here were of the 3 at least, were for ecological and economic, and I think that's important because that's sort of entering into this is sort of the paramount goal of being able to provide economic benefits while at the same time sort of protecting resources. Interestingly though, you see that the fewest synergies occurred among economic and social outcomes, suggesting that it may be hard to sort of balance high economic returns or economic benefits and to do so in a way that's sort of socially just or equitable or produces other kind of social benefits. But again, this is sort of the work in progress, and feedback on this in this process would be helpful. So in terms of our sort of multivariate approach to understanding the key factors here, in terms of ecological and social synergies, we see that capacity building, strong institutions, and project age were critical. In terms of economic and social, we see capacity and project age again. There were no significant predictors in our models for economic and ecological, although capacity building was important in so I'll have to go through the whole process, so if you have questions for this after. What we did was we imputed missing values, so we created basically 5 data sets and ran these models for our 5 data sets with imputed missing values. For 3 of those models for ecological and economic, capacity building was a significant predictor, but when we pooled all 5 of them, it was not. And then when we looked at all 3, for synergies among all 3 outcomes, again, capacity building and project age, and engagement was also important. I had to remove it from the model because it wouldn't allow the model to converge, because almost every case in which there was ecological, economic, and social success had high levels of engagement. So it was sort of an identity problem. We had to pull that out. So we see that capacity building and project age are important for sort of each set of synergies. And this is sort of where I'm fumbling around a little bit trying to figure out what is it about capacity building that's so critical here. And the way we measure capacity building was combining sort of 2 measures. One was looking at the individual level in terms of skills, techniques, tools that were provided to individuals to be a part of the project. One was looking at whether they sort of maintained or reinforced local institutions, so at the institutional level. And so we put those together, and that was our sort of capacity building measure. And there's been previous work that clearly capacity building should be important, but sort of understanding the actual mechanism that's involved there and why it alone, along with project age, seems to show up for each of those pairs of synergies, I think is interesting. And I think it could partially be just about acting through institutions. Maybe it's the institutional level that's driving this. But I'm sort of curious to hear what you all might think about this sort of broader, more holistic sort of capabilities approach that Amartya Sen is championing. This idea that focusing on sort of holistic human development might be critical in these projects, and that the other outcomes you see are sort of side effects. That if you put a lot of energy into building capacity among the community level, forgetting about ecological resources and economic benefits, attitudes and behaviors, but work with building sort of human capability in these communities, will that have ripple effects in terms of positive outcomes across the board? And that's something I'm sort of toying around with. It's a hypothesis, and I need to do a little bit more reading, but I'm just kind of curious about how that might work. And in terms of project age, it's, I think, simply just a matter of time and patience, that these projects will take time, they'll evolve over time, markets will change over time, resource dynamics will change over time, and it takes time for these things to sort of equilibrate and try to reach an optimal level across the board. In terms of caveats, I mentioned the quality of the data. There's a huge range in terms of data quality. I think another important aspect to think about is what specific outcomes are measured. So again, there's no sort of standardized list of indicators that you should use for any given outcome. And that causes problems between studies, but it also causes issues in terms of trade-offs within particular outcomes. So you could have an ecologist that comes to look at a forest and says, this thing's in great shape, it's got lots of biomass, carbon sequestration levels are great. You could have another ecologist that comes in and says, this forest is really species poor, so I'm going to consider this a failed project. It's just, you've got trade-offs within those particular domains. And then of course you have trade-offs at the spatial scale between domains, or even within domains again, where some communities or villages that are part of this project benefit greatly, and others don't. And maybe that success at one point in time might change greatly 10 years later. And finally, social outcomes are not often reported. So that seems to be sort of ignored a little bit in a lot of these studies, is that these sort of intangible social benefits or failures aren't often reported on. So I think, sort of summing up here, there was a lot of emphasis on the number of synergies and what things are associated with synergies, but I don't want to cloud over the fact that trade-offs do need to be part of the conversation, particularly with these local communities. I think we're doing a disservice to communities if practitioners are coming in and focusing on win-win scenarios and synergies without sort of putting on the table the real potential and the real decisions that need to be made about trade-offs, because they're going to occur, and it's going to be important that the community has an awareness of and a contribution to making these trade-offs and making decisions about these trade-offs. So just to kind of wrap things up, again, this was about sort of the importance of measuring multiple outcomes, both to give you a sense of the overall project itself, but also to force the discussion about synergies and trade-offs. Project design was key both for individual outcomes and for synergy, and I think that moving ahead, understanding these dynamics of community-based conservation will continue to be critical, especially as REDD+ programs come on board. This is reduced emissions from deforestation and forest degradation. You'll only see community-level sort of conservation efforts become more prominent moving ahead. So I will just leave things there, and happy to answer any questions that you